Hey Maria, how's it going?
Hi, good morning, Shovik. How are you today?
Good. There's the total darkness outside in Seattle right now. There's I can literally not see beyond like I don't know 20 feet outside in the road. So yeah, it's a weird morning. All right, cool. Thanks again for joining us today. For those of you who just started watching this video without seeing the previous one, we're doing a new series where I'm sort of writing like a fictitious application for business school, taking most of my pre-MBA experience, but also adding some new stuff as I go from my current job. The main goal here is to craft an application from scratch, build a resume, write essays based on five different schools. In the last video, we talked about school selection. We talked a little bit about goals. For this one, I'm gonna show Maria my embarrassing resume, and she's gonna, give me all sorts of updates and all sorts of suggestions, right? So that's the main goal. In the next few videos, we'll go through the other parts of the application. We'll look at it from essays standpoint. We'll look at recommendations, and then we'll look at also smaller, finer details like the application form and things like that, right? So, Maria, before we start with my resume, let me ask you this. What are the most common resume mistakes that you see for MBA applications?
I think the two biggest mistakes I see in order of kind of, I think, priority, I think the biggest mistake is not conveying effectively what your impact was.
Right.
So keeping in mind that most admissions officers do not have engineering degrees, they don't necessarily have economics degrees, they don't necessarily have very technical jobs. Many of them come from a background in human resources. And
Right.
so you might, let's say you were an electrical engineer earlier in your career and you redesign a microchip to utilize DNA style encoding, whatever, like, I'm not going to know what that means. Another electrical engineer would read that and say, holy cow, that's incredible. You did that. But somebody who is in a business school environment, they're not going to know. And so being able to convey to someone what I kind of rudely call the so what about,
Yeah.
like, so, oh, I designed this new thing. So what? Like, what's the big deal? You need to be able to explain that in a way that an average person can understand. If you say, I redesigned a new data chip to do whatever, and it utilized tungsten, tungsten chloride, whatever, I'm like, okay, huh? But if you say, I helped increase profits by 15%, aka $20 million, by coming up with this awesome new chip design.
Right.
Now, even if I don't know anything about chips, I understand. I don't know anything about chips, but I do understand money. So anything that involves anything with money, obviously, but even if your job does not involve any sort of financial outcome, even if, let's say, I know you were a teacher, so if you say something like, look, when I started at teaching at this classroom, only 15% of the students were literate. By the time I was done with them 8 months later, 85% of them were literate, right? So being able to convey, like, wow, instead of just saying, well, I taught them how to read.
Right.
Okay, but if you can quantify it, or if you can convey what was that delta between you arriving and you being done with whatever that project was, that helps me understand what your impact was. The second biggest mistake I see is very similar, which is getting too technical into these details of, like, things that I'm not going to understand, that are very obvious to anyone living your life,
Yeah.
but the average admissions reader isn't living your life. And then I think, finally, I know I said two, but then I realized my second one was very related to my first one. So my other one I would say is thinking that the resume has to include literally everything you've ever done in your job, that it has to include every responsibility you have, that it has to include, no, it's not a list of everything you've ever done. It's sort of like your greatest hits. So whatever you've done that has the most impact, put that in. You don't have to put, if you're the person at the meeting who takes notes and then disseminates the notes at the end of the meeting, that is a very junior, low-level task. Don't put that on your resume.
Right.
Right? Don't put the low level stuff, because first of all, it's a waste of space. And second of all, you don't want me to look at you and be like, oh, she's just the note taker. They must not respect her very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are super important. I think when I was writing my first resume, the impact was really challenging for me, especially for like a pretty non-traditional experience, like getting that measurable data for every single thing that I've done. I think that was challenging, and I think I think sometimes I felt that even qualitative measurements were totally fine, like better than no measurement at all. The other thing that I struggled with, was to understand the difference between like an accomplishment that goes to a resume as opposed to like a responsibility that does not. So I kind of learned that, if it's something that I get paid for, right, it just doesn't belong there, right, because I'm expected to do that. But if it's something where I went above and beyond, where things went much better than they would if I weren't there, I think that those make good candidates for resume bullets. Did you see those kind of things when you review candidates' resume at all?
Yeah, that's another good way to think about it, right? I sort of quip that people shouldn't put either janitorial or secretarial roles in their resume. And I don't mean that you're literally a janitor or a secretary, but I mean anything where you're cleaning something up for someone else, like, oh, I fixed the data, I corrected the typos in the grant application. And also like realize that, first of all, let's say you are some sort of massive electrical engineering type. I already assume that that comes with certain responsibilities, right? So if you say, well, I helped launch a new chip, I would assume that that involves some sort of technical work. I would assume that that involves some sort of designing. So don't
Right.
waste space saying, well, I designed it and I sat down and I took out a piece of paper and I drew what it would look like. Like that's all assumed. So in terms of responsibilities, either a lot of your responsibilities are already obvious given the job title, given how many thousands of applications they see every year, or they're frankly not that important. So
Yeah.
if you have a very technical job, I think we talked about this before, like I'm not hiring you to be in my MBA class for you to become an engineer to come fix my computer chip. I'm hiring you to become a leader 20 years from now. That's going to make my school proud. So I do think that some responsibilities, there might be a little bit, especially if your responsibility involves managing others, that's probably the most important aspect you could put. But it doesn't have to be, I wouldn't put that as a bullet point. I would put that in the background blurb right above the bullet point.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I think finally, before we jump into my resume, like I know I've already done a lot of resume research in the past, so I fully understand I may be slightly more advanced for most of our audience out there. But one question that I wanted to clarify before we go was, let's say, so I'm calling out that I graduated in 2013, right? So I will talk about 8 years of work, right? And I think I can fit 8 years of work, then some stuff from my college days and like a hobby in a page. But people often struggle. I think it sort of becomes like, okay, can my resume exceed a page? Do you have a litmus test of when that's appropriate?
So the resume should never exceed a page if you're applying to a typical 2-year program. The general rule is if you have 10 years or more of experience, then maybe you can go over a page. But if you have more than 10 years of experience, you probably shouldn't be applying to a typical 2-year MBA program anyway.
Right.
And even then, like, I think I've mentioned this before when we've talked, like my husband has over 20 years of experience and his resume is still one page. Because the fact is the stuff that you did long ago doesn't really matter, right? You were beginning your career, you really were probably doing junior stuff because most of us do junior stuff when we're younger. That's the nature of entry level work. And so that sort of stuff is not really that important to me because if you were terrible at that job, you would have gotten fired, right? So it would have said like, okay, well, you were there for 3 months. And so from that, I would glean, okay, well, maybe this person was pretty bad at that job. So what I do is I call it the real estate rule, which is the amount of space you spend on the page should be directly proportional to how much attention you want the reader to pay attention to it. So
Right.
don't put 4 bullet points for your current job, 4 bullet points for your last job, and then 4 bullet points for the job you had before that. The job you had 2 jobs ago is probably not that relevant
Yeah.
really for your application. And even if you had, let's say you had multiple internships in college, unless you are a pretty recent graduate, unless you graduated maybe 2-3 years ago from college, I would not even list the college internships either anywhere on the resume, or if anywhere, you could put them under education and you could lump them together in one bullet point, right? You could say summer internships included working at the United Nations,
Sure. Yeah.
Microsoft, whatever, and then just get out of there because it's just not relevant. Just like it's not relevant to you that in 5th grade I won some award in my elementary school.
Hey,
Like,
it
you
was
don't care.
important.
It was important for me,
How
but
did you know about that? Cool. Yeah, so I think we're at a good start to talk to the resume now. By the way, for people who are watching, feel free to drop questions and we can get to those as well. So let me just quickly share my screen, Maria, and then we can look at the resume together. Yeah? All right. So I hope you can see my resume. So I started off with the experience section. From the top, though, like I want to, I think I mentioned that I want to talk through some of my current work to improve my application from the last time, right? But I also want to be careful. Like I don't want this to be a post MBA type of a role, but at the same time, like I want to have similar impact that I'm able to make my job. And also because this is my current job, some of the personally identifiable things are redacted. Okay, cool. So let's start there. So but why don't I give you like a couple minutes to like read through this, read through maybe the first bullet point and get your high level thoughts there.
Okay, so before I even get to the first bullet point, and I'm sure you meant to do this. I don't have a title, and I don't have a.
Yes,
I'm
that is correct. I
so
think it got removed when I was redacting my stuff.
right. So associate product manager
Yeah,
sounds great. So between the company name and the dates, and then where the bullets start. For me, bullets should be about accomplishments. But
right.
between those two, I like to give the reader sort of like the lay of the land. Like what's the context in which you're doing this stuff? So for example, if you work at a certain division of company name, for people who work at big companies, right, very large companies like Google, for example, if you can't just say, well, I work at Google, because Google could be AdWords, it could be Maps, it could be the now defunct Loon project where they had balloons that were delivering internet to Namibia, right? Whatever that was. So first, give me some sort of context of which division of this very large company you work for.
Right.
And then you could say, since product manager is kind of a well-known title, you don't have to say an associate product manager is responsible for the roadmap for whatever, because like I get that. But if you are, for example, managing a team, something like that, that would be a good thing to talk about. Or you could say, regularly liaise, or, if you're not literally managing them formally, but if you are kind of informally managing them, you could use a term like coordinate, to help kind of convey that, okay, they don't technically report to me, but I am responsible for them on some level.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, so moving down to the very first bullet point, and this is something where my advice does differ from that of other admissions consultants. So it's up to each individual to determine whose advice they think is more valid. But when you're talking about describing an accomplishment, very frequently you'll see the advice to follow the STAR format: situation,
Sure.
task, action, result. I think that format works great if you are sitting with someone telling them a story, because that way there's kind of a verbal narrative where you can use the inflection in your voice to say, oh, well, there was this really big problem, and whew, I did the following 6 things, and hooray, it all worked. For a resume, though, since you're not there telling the story, I actually, as often as possible, I advocate starting with a result first. Because, well, why is that? Because as an admissions officer, I'm not reading 1 application a day. I'm reading maybe 20 applications a day, maybe 40 applications a day if my admissions office is really understaffed and we're up against a deadline. So when I start reading this, I'm like, okay. And this is just human nature, right? Identified feature gaps in a product, led a build of new features to optimize. So first, some of this is kind of obvious. Like obviously, if you identify a gap, then you would build a new feature to fill in that gap.
Sure.
You would not build a new feature that doesn't fill a gap. So you could probably just say, I built new features, or I led a team to build new features. As opposed, you don't have to say that thing twice. And then, by the time I get to the end, I'm like, optimize storage spend for customer. Like I'm already losing interest.
Yeah.
Especially because I have so many. I'm like, oh God, I have like 5 more resumes to get to before I can get out of here tonight. And so if you say, well, I did all this stuff, and then by the end, it's like, wait, total cost of ownership by 40%. That actually sounds interesting, but by that time, I'm sort of bored.
Mm,
So a couple of things. I would start with, I reduced some sort of cost by 40% at the beginning.
right.
Since I don't live in your world, I don't know what cost of ownership means. I guess it's your client's costs for your customers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but is it your employer that is saving that money, or is it your customers that are saving that money?
Customers.
Okay, so helped customers save 40% of costs, and then tell me, because you work for a big company, I'm thinking that that 40% number probably translates to a pretty big dollar figure.
Right.
So if somebody works at like a very small company and they have a 40% increase, maybe just keep it at the 40% because that's a big number. But if somebody works at a large company, that 40% is now might mean millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's going to be something that catches my eye. Simultaneously, if somebody works at a very big company, they might have had an impact that's $100 million impact, but on a percentage basis, it's something like 2.5%.
Right.
And so 2.5% sounds pathetically small, but in fact, it's a huge impact when you're talking about millions of customers, right? So think about which variation, which combination of data is going to help have more of that wow factor.
Cool. Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense. I do think that starting with the result impact makes more sense because it automatically hooks the reader into like, yeah, this seems like a really big deal.
yes, exactly. And then the other thing I would think about, if applicable, is, and then maybe this could be included in this bullet point, or I know you don't like sub bullet points, but I sometimes think that if you have one thing that you worked on that actually had like several impressive things about it, sometimes if you smush them all into one bullet, again, the I might skip over. I might be like, yeah, I get it, and I skip on to the next one, and I miss that sort of second cool point
Yeah.
you want to make. So sometimes you might want to consider putting a bullet point beneath this one, but indenting it a little bit to indicate that it's part of it, sort of like the child bullet point of the
Right.
bullet above it. And so, for example, one thing that in this situation, if you reduce that cost so much for your clients, maybe that helped your sales team win more client deals. Maybe that reduced churn amongst your clients. In other words, maybe that helped your clients stay with your company as opposed to go to a competitor. So even though your individual project did not directly impact the bottom line of your employer, it is indirectly impacting the bottom line because it's going to make you guys more competitive in the market. So that's another so what that you might be able to talk about. And even if you're like, well, Maria, I don't have a number for that, that's okay. You can just say like, sales team reported happier customers or something like that, to at least convey that, hey, this had this broader impact, and it's making us more competitive in the long term.
That makes sense. It also helps, not to have the bullet look like it's an entire narrative paragraph. So it kind of breaks down that story.
Yeah, yeah. And I know this is a Google Doc, and so I know that the formatting in Google Docs is always a bit, it's not as nice as it can be in Word. But one thing I like about what you've done here is that there's good white space between each of the bullets, because it's, if one bullet looks like a big narrative block, if you have all the bullets with the same amount of spacing between them, then
Yeah.
all of the bullets together give an effect of one huge paragraph.
Yeah.
And human nature, when you see that pop up on your screen, is to go like, oh, right? Come on. Admissions officers are human too. They don't want to read a novel. So by having a nice amount of white space between each bullet, I feel like, okay, this is manageable.
Cool. That makes sense. Do you want to maybe go through another bullet for this one, and then maybe we can talk about some of the other experience as well?
Yeah, let's see. So for the next one, I won't go into as much detail for the next one, but just the one that jumps out at me here is, again, like, what is a scalable event notification? Like, what does
Sure.
that mean, right? So instead of saying a scalable event notification, maybe you say something like error messages or something like, how would you describe this in very plain English?
Yeah, it's a
Um,
little tricky, this one. This one I struggled with. I mean, event notification is like a super technical thing, right? It's more about, like, think about, like, if let's say you have an application, like let's say you have an application like Applicant Lab, right? Let's say one of your customer sends a support email to Applicant Lab, and with that support email, that sort of triggers an event that maybe sends you a notification, or then sends a customer an automated response, or does something with that message, or maybe archives that message to a specific folder and things like that. So that's kind of what event notification is. Like, you take action based on one thing to do multiple things. But it's like a technical architecture term for sure.
Right. So whenever anyone has a struggle like this, just keep asking yourself, and again, not to be rude, but like, so what? Like, what does it mean to my client that they get that event notification? So what? Well, I allow my clients to react more quickly. Or maybe the so what here isn't so much that they're getting the event notifications, but I see the word scalable there. So maybe it's that it's more about, it makes your it's less cost for your company to send these notifications, right? So the so what here matters, because then the more you just keep asking yourself so what until you get to that core way to describe what was that final impact. I saved my employer $3 million a year by reducing the cost to send out warning messages to clients, or helped clients identify potential errors 30%, 70% faster or whatever by finding faster ways to send them error messages, right? The way how I just worded it is a little too simplistic, but it's better. It's more in the right direction than a scalable event notification.
That makes sense. I knew you'd kind of quip at that. Like, I think scalable event notification is a horrible way to say. Like, imagine talking to a friend who does not live in the cloud world. I think you would lose that friendship like as soon as you say scalable notification.
I often, as we talked about in the last video in this series, I often say, like, imagine that you're describing it to your dentist, but maybe it's just imagine that you're describing it to a friend, or like someone you just met on like a dating app. Maybe that's I should modify my advice, right? Like, if you're like in a dinner with someone you've just met and you're like, hey baby, I work on scalable event notifications, it's going to be like, okay, well,
It's
check
over.
these. Right. Done. But if you say something like, actually, I've helped 4 million companies service their clients better because they know earlier that something's gone wrong. Like, hey, how many times have anyone can relate to that, right? You log into a website, you're trying to book your plane ticket, it doesn't work. Yesterday, I was trying to buy a COVID test online, and I was literally watching in the cart. Like, I was like adding enough in my cart for everyone in my family to get one. And then it's like, sorry, now we only have 2 in stock. Sorry, now we have 0 in stock. And then like the page like crashed, and I was like, so like, I can imagine, I don't live anywhere in the cloud world, but as an end user, if you say, well, the so what here, Maria, is that whenever a website crashes, now they can fix it faster because they know about this, because my system let them know, like, yoo-hoo, something's wrong. However, that's how you need to think about describing what's that ultimate impact. So the next bullet point is kind of similar. So, similar to the first bullet point. By the way, we talked a minute ago about what do you do if you just don't have enough room on your resume? In a case like this, let's say the first bullet point reduced your customer storage spend by $100 million, and the third bullet point reduced it by $300 million. You could always combine those two together by saying, I help my customers save aggregate or cumulative or $300 million total by, and then maybe you do 2 different sub bullets for each of the big projects, or you say by leading 2 projects that reduce the cost of their storage. So that way you can combine them. This is where I was saying before, you don't have to list out every single thing you've done. You can omit some things, or you can combine them together to put that aggregate impact if you are short on space.
Sure, that makes sense.
And then for the last bullet point, so this is an interesting one, right? Because this is you presented content at a conference, you were doing stuff to sort of help educate others at a big conference. So, but that's a tough one, right? Because it's really hard. How do you quantify that impact? So first of all, if this was any sort of an honor to be chosen to do this, you can say something like selected as 1 out of 50 product managers, right? So chosen by management, something like that, to let me as a reader know that this was a big deal, right? Because I don't live in your world. So I don't know if every associate product manager gets to speak at this conference. Maybe everyone gets to do it. Or if you getting chosen is like a huge leap of faith, maybe normally only senior product managers get to do it, but you're such a rock star that they chose you to do it a few years earlier. So conveying like, I don't really actually care what your topic was as an admissions reader. Like,
Yeah.
okay, because someone else could, someone who's in biology could be like, oh, the genetic phenotype, whatever. And it's like, phew. But if I know that you were chosen specially to do something that is a bit of an honor, conveying that could be good. You could just say something like, I presented, this is one where, okay, you did developer content. So it sounds like you did maybe like some articles maybe, and then you also did stuff at the company conference. This is one where I feel like you could consolidate feature launches, tech talks, data lake architectures. I think you would just say, selected to present information for 20,000 colleagues, including at the company, like pick the most important one or the most impressive one, which I would guess is presenting something at a huge conference in front of 3,000 teammates or something like that. Or you present it on a live stream, at a conference that was live streamed to 500 customers across the world, something like that. So yeah, there might not be a quantitative impact to you giving this presentation, but maybe you can help me figure out why it was important that you were chosen, or how many people tuned in, or maybe it was a small number, absolute number, but that's where we go back to our percentages. Maybe only 100 people tuned in. Well, that sounds pretty small, but when you say, but that's 85% of our global engineering team, for someone at a smaller company, now I'm like, oh, 85, that's almost everyone. So this maybe this was a big deal.
No, that makes sense. It's also, like as you mentioned, the content's not really that important. It's more about the reach of it, and like when you're starting off as like an associate PM role where you are not supposed to have like a lot of responsibilities. I think calling that out as like an exceptional achievement, I think that's more important. I think one thing that I didn't do, and I was thinking of calling it out in this video, is like, in the PM function, a big part of your job, or like, the most important thing in your job is to be able to get other people to do your stuff without, having any authority over them at all, right? So there's like opportunities to collaborate, opportunities for like a lot of cross-functional work, and I felt like that's entirely missing in this whole thing. So that's kind of the story behind your bullet point, right? Like when you say you launched feature Y, feature X, whatever, do you think it would be so? So what I did here was to talk about the hard details of what this product ended up doing for our customers. But I think the other way to look at it, and maybe they are not exclusive, is to talk through the journey of building that product, right? Like you worked with, like engineers, you worked with marketers, you worked with UX designers, and made sure like everybody was on board with your design, right? I would say it's a little bit different from like a project manager job. So I wasn't necessarily tracking that they're doing things on time, but the goal was that, hey, are we even aligned on what we want to do? Like, and then convincing them that, hey, my idea is better.
Exactly. So let's start with so the way how you would do that is when you say something like, let's go to the first bullet. When I led the build of new features, it would be more like led a team of 5. You might not have room to list out like UX designers, back-end designers, data architects, right? You might not be able to list comma, 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 this person, this person, this person, but maybe you say like a team of 6. Or a multi, something like that. And then you could say something like persuaded a team of 6 to align on feature set, which led to an on-time launch.
Gotcha.
You can tell some of that story in the bullet points. And if you have to choose between a technical accomplishment versus an interpersonal one, always choose the interpersonal one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good tiebreaker to use. Cool. Awesome. So I want to skip over the GMAT Club stuff a little bit because I want to talk through some of my more non-traditional work experience and get your take on those. So maybe we can look at the Teach for India stuff and move up, like move in reverse order for a change. So maybe we can look at some of the Teach for India stuff, and maybe we can talk about like my school leadership startup.
Yeah, great. So can you just scroll down a little so Teach for India moves up higher? There we go.
Totally.
There we go. Great.
By the way, just to give you like a little bit of context, like you may remember this from the time when you were actually helping me to send applications to schools. So I did the Teach for India fellowship program, which is very similar to what Teach for America does, right? So you get placed in a really like a low income underserved community where you teach full time for 2 years, right? So I taught middle and high school, so there was an overlap there because I taught like 8th and ninth grade. And yeah, I was teaching like about 100 students. I was teaching math and English, and that's kind of the context. But I'm happy to like give you more info if you need it.
Sure. So I think so since Teach for India is a pretty well-known organization, I don't think I would again advocate a sort of a background blurb that goes between the title and dates and then the actual
Right.
bullet points. So I don't think you have to say Teach for India is a fellowship that like I think that's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
If it were a very teeny nonprofit with 5 employees, then you might want to explain a little bit more what it does. But I think what you would say is that responsibility would go into that little blurb, right? Taught middle school math for 2 years, taught 100 students a year in middle school math for 2 years or whatever, something like that. So that way, again, I have the setting, I have the context. Okay, middle school math, 100 kids a year, got it. Now let me jump into what those accomplishments were.
Right.
And so what I think here, what going into the first bullet point, most people who do teach for whatever, most people improve the students' ability, right? It's very, I've never seen anyone be like, oh, I'm a charter school teacher in inner city Chicago, and my students actually did worse, right? Like I've never seen anyone. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure it happens, but if so, those people don't put that on their resume. So most people, when they do something like this, they do improve the students' test scores by a certain amount. So yes, you can leave that in there. I increased the reading skills by 2.5 grade levels. But what's even better is you could say something like, my students had the highest increase out of 40 schools in Mumbai. Something like that, right? So that would be a better thing to put, just because it's sort of expected. Like most, after you read a lot of these, and this is also another piece of advice that I think applies to a lot of people, you might be the only person in your circle of friends who does Teach for India. So you're like, oh man, 2.5 years of reading improvement, 3 years of math improvement. This is amazing. But in the applicant pool, remember that there are probably, I can't tell you the number of times I get emails of people who are like, I have a very unique profile. I'm a Teach for India teacher. And I'm like, you're the 7th Teach for India teacher who has reached out to me this week, right? So just keep in mind that there are other people like you in the applicant pool. So a lot of times, you might be like, oh, 2.5 grade levels and 3, this grade level, this is amazing. But what you might not realize is there might be 5 other Teach for India teachers who have had a 4-year increase, right? So anything, they all start to blur together. Like some people have a 1.8 year increase or a 4-year increase or whatever. So anything you can do to help me as a reader understand why this was cool or why this was notable. If it wasn't notable, great, just keep it as is. But if you're like, actually, Maria, like the truth is, like, I don't want to toot my own horn, but no other Teach for India teacher did as well as I did in the entire city of Mumbai that year, then maybe that's what you focus on more than that data.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like just so you know, I think a lot of these increasing by these many grade levels, I think there are some issues with this kind of data. Like you can think about like if every single Teach for India teachers were increasing their grade levels by so much, like India wouldn't really have an education problem, right? So there's like a concept of like students' learning levels dropping in the summer when they're not in school and things like that. So I'm pretty sure. By the way, you're totally right. A lot of Teach for India people apply to business schools, and I'm sure that's also true for many like Teach for things, right? So for admissions, like these grade level talks can get really busy and really incomprehensible, like really quickly.
Yes. So I think that's don't worry about the fact like, well, there's actually been a lot of controversy about whether or not the grade level assessment is accurate or not. Like that doesn't matter for our purposes, right? If that was the rubric you're given, if that's what designates a successful Teach for India teacher, it's not up to you in the application to worry about like litigating, like, is that really the right metric to get? No, if that's the metric you're given as success, then it's fine to stay with that metric.
Sure.
But it's just more like, yeah, they all start to blend together. And then I think the thing that's actually the most interesting thing here is that you say that you use digital apps to provide feedback. So this is interesting because I think one of the, for me, the three main pillars of leadership are innovation, initiative, and persuasion. And it sounds like maybe you might have introduced these sorts of digital apps. So I would make it clear, if that were the case, if you were the first person to either do apps in general or to choose these specific apps, if you had to convince someone, again, going back to those interpersonal skills, if you had to convince the principal to allow you to introduce the apps, right? Maybe the principal was like, there's no computer that makes up for a good book. And you're like, actually, some of these can be really good, right? So if you had to if you persuaded principal to launch first ever pilot program of digital literacy app that increased reading levels to the high, that's a much more compelling story. So if you have anything like that where you had to persuade others, where you had to convince others to follow your lead, where you looked around and you're like, guys, why aren't we using this app? This app's amazing. That sort of thing is actually better than some of the other things people will put is like, oh well, I helped ensure. They talk about very, very expected things, right? Like I tracked students' progress. And it's like, well, every teacher does that everywhere in the world for the most part. So highlighting those sorts of things are also a really good idea.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And I also think it kind of aligns with my goal, right? Like that's the goal that I'm trying to pitch. So I want to bring more attention to like, okay, this is my foundation. By the way, you can read more about it in my essays.
Yeah, great point, because you do have an ed tech goal. You want to establish the credibility that you actually know something about ed tech. Excellent.
All right, cool. What do you think of the second bullet for Teach for India?
I think this is really powerful. How many? So 200 students per year, but it was 100 mil. So first of all, in terms of, so 200 students is a big number in general. If it happens to be a huge percentage of the school, I might also put 200 students, 90% of the school, the total students per year, just so that way I have a sense of like, if the school has 40,000 kids in it, 200 is great. But if you help like most of the kids in the school, then that's even better.
Yeah, I mean, I think 200 students in that school would be close to like 20%. So it was my class and somebody else's class.
Oh, then just leave it at 200 then. If it was like if it wasn't like a huge percentage, we'll just leave it at 200. That's fine. I think the one thing that's interesting here though is the 50K, right? Like again, giving me some sort of context about, because 50K in the US is a lot, and in India it must be an astronomical amount, right? So if $50,000 here for a school in Los Angeles would be significant, it must be even a bigger deal for India. So again, anything that you could say like raise $50,000, parentheses, highest amount of money raised in TFI history, or 400% above target, or anything like that, to really emphasize, guys, this $50,000 is a life-changing amount of money, right? Because especially at a school like some of these business schools, $50,000 is like less than the tuition they get from one student for 1 year. So anything like that context really helps. And then here for 100% graduation rates and 80% distinction rates, I would just focus on 100% grad. I would think to myself, but when you think about it, both of those numbers are saying very similar things. Right. You help the students do better. And so since it's sort of repetitive, right? You wouldn't get an 80% distinction rate, but a 20% graduation rate. So I would pick one of the two, and I would pick the one that sounds the most powerful. And for me, that would be the 100% graduation rate. And then tell me what it was before. I would, instead of saying 100% graduation rate and 80% distinction rate, I would rather use that space to say 100% graduation rate, parentheses, usually 42%.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, 40% or like 2x increase or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because again, if the graduation rate, 100% graduation rate is wonderful, but if the previous graduation rate before you raised the 50,000 was 95%, it's still wonderful, but it's even more wonderful.
Just feels like regular inflation there. Cool. So I know we're running sort of out of time. I wanted to maybe take your quick take on the education section, which I now see that I didn't put in. Let me just put it in. Let me just put it in real quick. Just gonna paste here really quickly. So this is because I'm still saying that I graduated in 2013, so I'm advancing it by 2 years, which would still mean that I am close to, I think, 29 when I'm matriculating in business school, right? So I'm still on the older side, right? So I didn't want to spend a ton of time with like my college or my internship. Just wanted to bring attention to one extracurricular thing that I did and call it a day. But I wanted to take your advice there.
Yeah, so especially, I think your intuition to not put in internships is a good one, especially if they were technical internships that have nothing to do now with the path that you're on. I mean, you don't need to tell me that you did engineering internships because you were an engineering major. And so I'm not asking myself, does this person understand engineering? And now you have a technical role. That's not a question I have. Like, does this person understand engineering? So you don't need to answer a question that isn't being asked. I like the bullet point here because I think it does show, it shows leadership, but it also shows actual impact, right? It answers that question of so what. It might be described a little bit increasing total job offers for the class by 29%. I think that it's good because it has 29%. If that was like a record, again, like it's, sometimes people listen to things like this that I say and they're like, but it wasn't a record, so am I screwed? And I'm like, no, it's not that you're screwed if it wasn't a record. But if it was a record, if it was, or like during 2013 was not necessarily a recession, but if it was like during a recession or during a hard hit year or something like that, to really make that accomplishment even more contextually impressive, then so much the better.
2013 was actually a really good year because we were like coming out of recession, and the 29% could be totally because of nothing that I did, and just like macro trends in the economy.
But the 200 companies, the new companies coming to campus was you. Like, so that's the one. If you have to pick between the two things to talk about, maybe that's the one you focus on because that's something you actually did. Did you have any other leadership?
Yeah, like I did. I did. I think every single Indian person talk about this, but I actually led like a festival in college.
A cultural festival.
Yes, but I don't want to put that in because I'm just like I've seen that so many times now. I kind of regret that I did it in the first place because everybody does it. So I didn't want to talk about it.
Funny. It's so funny because like that is if you would have said to me when I started doing this, I don't know, 18 years ago, like, Maria, cultural festivals are a really big deal in India, I would have never believed it. And then I see it all the time on resume. People are like, I led this cultural festival. And I'm like, I have never in my life heard of a cult. Like, that's just not, I mean, people in US colleges, they'll organize a dance performance or they'll organize but it's a very different scope and a different scale. So for those of you who did organize cultural fests and want to put it on your resume, just make sure that you emphasize, again, any increases, it went from 10,000 attendees to 20,000 attendees, or, but you don't need to tell me about like, we had 17 different acts and we had jugglers and we had belly dancers and we had lion tamers. Like, I don't need to know those details. But yeah, it's shocking. Like, it was something I had never, I went from being something I had never really encountered before to something that now like everyone does. And I'm like, it's so interesting. But so yeah, I'm not, just because we're sort of bashing, just because a lot of people do the cultural festival doesn't mean that it's worthless, but just make sure that you highlight the important parts of it.
All right, cool. It's also like, because I talked about like I held 5 jobs, I didn't have a lot of space. So I left my other section relatively empty because I was just running out of space, right? But I think I wanted to chat with you about the importance of the other section anyway. I think I see a lot of resume where the other section becomes like, okay, so before we go there, my general idea for the other section is like, if it sounds like work, it shouldn't be there. But that's just my idea, because I feel like nobody goes to the bottom of the resume just to find something similar to what they have read before, right? I generally look at the bottom of the resume. It's like, okay, fine, I know this guy can do stuff. Let me see what this guy actually does when he's off work. So curious to know, like, what you think of the other section.
Well, of course, I think that way, but I don't know if maybe a lot of it is just me, like after years of hearing me kind of pummel this into your head, Shovik. Like maybe it's, of course I agree with you because like that's what I say over. I say that sort of thing over and over again. So yeah, so sometimes people under other will say something like, I led recruiting for my company. I led diversity recruiting for my company. For me, that is something that goes underneath your job description,
Right.
even though it's not technically part of your job, because then when I'm reading things, I think people tend to contextualize things in buckets of time and
Yeah.
not necessarily in buckets of, so like, yeah, so like if you're leading recruiting at your firm, that's something you're doing on top of your regular work. So that way, when I look at the actual product management accomplishments, I see, wow, and he on top of this, he's also doing the diversity recruiting. That's great. If you put it at the bottom, now all of a sudden I'm back to like, wait, so when was this? This was in 2019. Okay, so wait, that was this year? Right now I have to like think harder than otherwise. So yes, I agree with you. I think the other or the additional section should be anything that has nothing to do with work. I would actually put anything that is not your full-time job here. So I noticed that above you had the GMAT club moderator stuff. In
Yeah.
your case, I would actually advise that that goes underneath other because you're not getting paid for it. It's not, or you might be getting to start, but you're not getting paid for it full time. It's not your primary source of income.
Right.
So, and I don't want it. Normally, sometimes when people have a side gig, the challenge with putting that under experience is that then I'm reading the dates because in your mind you're like, well, it's obvious that this is not my full-time job, but for someone who has never met you before, I'm reading the dates and I'm like, wait a minute, that date overlaps with this date. So did they have two full-time jobs at once? But no, so how does that wait? So that means one of them have to be part, right? You don't want any moments where you're forcing the person to think more than they have to, because that's energy that's mental energy and cognitive energy that they could be spending to being impressed by you. So if anyone who has a side gig, who has a startup on the side, anything like that, for me that would go under other. And then yes, for other things under other, if you, sometimes a lot of people want to put their foreign languages. I think that's fine. A lot of time the foreign languages are a bit obvious. So for example, if someone is from Tamil Nadu, they might be like, oh, I speak Hindi, I speak Tamil, and I speak, English. And I'm like, well, okay, but if you grew up in that area, like
Yeah.
it's not necessary. So I really only advocate putting foreign languages if it's like something that's like really, if you're like, oh, I speak Japanese, I'd be like, wow, that is not expected given that he went to Jadavpur
Yeah.
University. And like, that, because also the other reason for that is that in the application form, I think one thing that we should all be thinking about is that they're not only going to read the resume, they also get an application form where they will ask you often, what are the languages you speak? What is your level of fluency in each
Right.
one? So don't feel like you have to put your foreign language there. And then, yes, I agree. I think the other is the space to humanize someone, especially in a world where there are so many people that look alike on paper. And also, this is where this ideally things here should be delightful and surprising. So if someone's a computer scientist and they say, well, in my spare time, I like to code video games. Okay, but we already know that you like to code. So that wouldn't, I mean, that could be cool. But if you're a computer scientist who likes to cook, who went to culinary school, now that is uncommon. That is something I would not expect. And so that's why I really like that what you chose here, that you finished culinary school and you sous chefed upscale. So when you come to visit me in LA, you're gonna stay with me and you're gonna cook for me because
Yeah,
that
I
is,
think so. I think I had when I was applying to schools, I had this other bullet point around, like fitness and things like that. But I just don't have any more space. So I totally agree with you. I think I was just giving this feedback. This was very deja vu for me. I was just giving this feedback to a Chinese national in America who spent like significant time in Beijing, but who was also talking about like, speak Mandarin in my other section, and that's it, just speak Mandarin. I was like, yeah, of course you do. Like, dude, that's how you speak with your parents.
Right.
And I
Exactly.
gave him this exact feedback. So it was a good recall for me. One other thing that kind of irks me in this other section, because I feel like if your other section is not really making me like, chuckle, then it's not really like used well enough. And I fully understand that not a lot of people have like colorful lives outside of work. People are busy. I totally get that. But there's one thing that it kind of bothers me is like professional certifications in the other section. And and I see
Gross.
and I see like a lot of that in like, I have like an SAP thing, or I have a PMP, or whatever acronyms you can come up with. Is there any way you think that can go in any section of the resume? Or like,
No.
okay, the worst offenders are like Microsoft Word and
No.
Excel.
Yeah. Oh God. Proficient with Excel. Oh no, please. Yeah. No. No. Gross. First of all, going back to the application form, if you have something like that is really impressive, they do have a section where you can put those certifications. But primarily, even if they don't, who cares? I don't care that you have a Six Sigma green belt, because like again, like I'm not hiring you to come to my business school and Six Sigma how my business school is run. I'm hiring you, when I admit you to my class, I am hiring you to become someone who 15, 20 years from now is going to go out and just kick lots of butt in the world and be a leader that people admire at a minimum, right? And
Right.
so and so I don't care if you have Six Sigma, PMP, I've been trained in whatever, Jira, ticket management. Who cares? That's not what I'm interested in. I'm much more interested in you convincing a bunch of people to do something cool, that because that to me signals interpersonal leadership skills. And those are the skills that in the long term people need to be successful. That Six Sigma green belt thing is not going to make you successful as a general manager in the long term. And that's what you need to be focusing on.
I feel like every time we talk about, like janitorial or secretarial tasks, you will inevitably bring up Jira. I kind of feel like there's a story there.
No, it's because it really isn't. It's because I try to like keep up with the hip new lingo, and I'm like, oh, what are the kids using these days? Right? Because like, yeah, I don't know, 10 years ago it was Trello, and then it was, I don't even remember what the bug tracking system that we used to use when I was working in product was, but I mean, it was it was like 10, 15 years ago. So I
Right.
don't even remember what it was called. But whatever the software du jour is, leave that stuff out too, right? Like, oh, what's the one? Tableau is the currently trendy data analytics platform, I think.
Yeah.
I don't care. I'm not hiring. That's not the job I'm hiring you for.
Right. Cool. That makes sense. This was awesome. Like I planned it for 45 minutes, but we went longer. Let me just stop sharing my screen. I think overall, I have some work to do. Right. I think my big takeaways from this review was, I think like de-jargonize as much as I possibly can. Right. I'm never going to say scalable event notifications to unless you're my coworker. You're never going to hear about it. The other thing that I learned from this one is like, contextualizing impact, right? Which could be either like, adding an extra dimension with like a so what, or trying to think about like every single bullet point, I write on the resume. Think about like, why is this bullet awesome, right? And try to get into the second order kind of benefit. It could be a benefit for the company. It could be an additional benefit for the customers. So I think those are my two key takeaways from here. And I think the other one that I also think is useful for my specific resume, because I have product related stuff in two jobs. Like I have that for my current role, and I also have that for GMAT Club. I think I want to take a quick look at like, am I repeating the same stuff? Like even if it's a different example, am I talking about the same thing? So I want to skip a little bit of that. But then finally, I think there is a context, especially in my product roles. I think there's a context missing on cross-functional work with other people, like getting buy-in from other people. And I think I want to highlight that a little bit more because that's the kind of skills that is, I think, the most transferable, right? Like you may not work on the same tech in the next job, but you will still need to convince somebody who thinks your idea is awful, right?
Yep,
So
that part never ends. The technology stack will change every 2 years, but having to convince people who are intransigent, that part never goes away.
awesome. I think one other nitpicky question here. I think I'm trending to see, especially for younger applicants who are kind of like 2 3 years out of college, a lot of their resume they ask like, okay, can I write this research paper that I wrote, or like my thesis at the end of my whatever. My answer is generally no. Like I think my answer is like, if you can't fill up a page of resume, you're not ready for business school, right? But okay, cool. I think I got your answer.
100%. And the reason for that, in case anyone's like, why are you being a hater when it comes to things like theses or research, is that oftentimes, again, think about what they're looking for. They're looking for interpersonal skills. A research paper is something you almost always do by yourself. And
Yeah,
so it doesn't really involve other people. So it's not valuable to me from that perspective. It's also involved, it's usually something that will have no impact on your future life. Like if you were an electrical engineering major, I don't care that you're very, very good at whatever it is.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, so I really only advocate it if, in the rare instance, if your research paper somehow changed the, either if you're making a career switch back into something that you majored in. I see this a
yeah.
lot of people who like majored in environmental something, and then they follow the money for a job in oil and gas. And then they say, oh, but now I'm coming to business school because I want to be Little Miss Sustainability. Maybe in that case, to provide some credence to the fact that you actually cared about the environment at some
Sure.
point. And so maybe then you say, oh, I did a thesis on solar power, whatever. So maybe in that case, but usually only if, the only times I've really advocated it was if somebody is like, I did a research paper where I invented a new thing that now my employer is using in their, I worked with someone who did an automotive mechanical engineering thing. They went to work at an automotive company that had sponsored their internship and sponsored that research, and today that company is actually using what this person developed. At least then there's an impact in the real world to this research. Most research has
Right.
very little real world impact, and so who cares?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for me it has to be like a ridiculously impressive thing. It can't just be like a thesis that everybody's supposed to do. I think my only exception here is a patent. Like if you have a patent that your company uses that you work really hard to get, it sort of offers your company like protection against rip-offs or knockoffs and things like that. I think that kind of makes sense, but I would again focus on the benefit of the patent and not what the patent itself. Like I don't want to link.
Exactly. So say something like, I helped co-author 3 patents that are protecting us from competitive threats, as opposed to, I helped author 3 patents. The name of the first one is patent number, serial number A26545, and the title is developing a system on, but I don't really care what the name of the patent is, because you're not applying to, again, if you're an engineer who works on a patent, and when you're applying to engineering school, tell me all about that patent.
Yeah,
But when you're applying to business school, I'm interested, but not super interested in the specifics.
yeah. Cool, awesome. We are now squarely out of time. Thanks, Maria, so much for helping me take a look at my resume. This is a quick refresher. Next week, we're going to talk about essays. So, what I plan on doing is, you know my 5 schools, but I'm going to take like the most unique essay from that specific school. So I'll have one goal essay, I have one like more personal expression essay, and then like one it could be based on like school quirks, right? So I'll pick some of the like off-topic type essays, like not traditional. So I will not write 2 goals essays, is what I'm saying, right?
Right.
And then get some thoughts on my essays. But I also go through the process of like storyboarding and figuring out which stories to write. So I'll share that when we meet again next week.
All right. Sounds great.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Maria, for spending the time. And everybody else, most of the resume stuff is on the Google Doc. You can review that, check that. I'll make some changes for that later in the week. And thanks so much for joining us today in the morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.